Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the News Behind the News with Ralph Cantav on Mix 94.7 FM. I hope that you've been having a good day so far. This afternoon, I have here with me, not a stranger to St. Martin, Dr. Francio Guadeloupe, who is an associate professor at the University of Amsterdam, also a senior researcher at the KITV. Good afternoon to you, sir, and thank you for coming on the program.
Good afternoon. I'm glad that you were willing to have me here.
Great. Yeah. So, just for a little bit of history, and I remember when we first touched base back when I was a student at USM. That's when you basically also became the president of the university before leaving. But of course, you've always visited St. Martin. Of course, I have roots in St. Martin and done a lot of research on the island as well. But one thing I do have to give you thanks for now that I'm sitting here in front of me is I remember during the time, when I expressed a desire to do something with media for the University of St. Martin, you hopped right on board and supported it, which was the program I did, St. Martin Speaks. I think that was a little over a year and a half that it lasted. And so with that, thank you, because it's interesting now, officially, as a career choice here on radio, having conversations with persons just as I did since 2016, 15.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. No, I think it's vital. Media is very important in any society. People need to get objective information, and the media should be the place where they get objective information, where they find out what's going on, but also the behind the scenes matters.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So for those who may not know you, could you just tell us a bit about yourself? And then we go into the research project that you're also conducting here at Island.
Well, briefly, as a youngster, I would run around in Dutch Quarter. That's, I always tell people there's where I'm from. I wasn't born there. I'm an Aruban, and I lived up until my teens in Aruba, but I consider myself someone from Dutch Quarter because I lived there with lots of pleasure and joy, and my mother and father are still there. So that's one of my homes, I often say. Mm. I left St. Martin to study abroad, like all teenagers do. Many teenagers do, I should say. And then I went to the Netherlands, and I went actually to study drama. I was going to be an actor. But when I arrived there, I passed, but then they said, we need you to understand more of the society, so spend a year at the Social Academy and then come back. Your space is set. So I went to the Social Academy, and I remained because I liked it there. Mm-hmm. I then got my bachelor's degree in social and cultural development. Afterwards, I then took a master in development sociology and anthropology. And I went to work like everyone else. But in the meantime, I had published 2 books because my master thesis was considered good enough to be published by the University of Nijmegen. That was on Brazil. So I was doing research in Brazil. And I also did a kind of psychological, anthropological book on Brazil. So I left the university and I had 2 books at hand. But I wasn't thinking about being an academic. I just had written the 2 books and I thought, this is fine. And I went to work first as a community development officer in a neighborhood in Rotterdam. And then I got the opportunity to participate in the Copenhagen 6 Climate Change Conference as one of the delegates of the Netherlands, and I was going to stream into becoming a diplomat. So that was the path that I was expected to take.
Any interest in that still?
I was interested in climate challenges. I was interested in diplomacy because it was about negotiating to make sure that we made the right decisions as far as CO2 emissions at that time. And I thought, okay, wonderful, if I can enter into the diplomatic corps, I'll do so. But it turned out that I got a call from someone who said, we've read these books and we're looking for a researcher to do research in Brazil. And then you'll enter a PhD trajectory. I couldn't at the time because I was part of that big UN conference. So I told him I can't. And then I said, because the research was to look at, it was right after the Cold War, so they were saying after the East and West divide, and we see it returning again with Russia and the United States, but there was a time in which that was gone, the end of the Cold War, and then people thought people will fight based upon ethnicity and religion. These will be now the markers of struggle. Wherever you have a lot of ethnicities together, there will be tensions and fights and wars, and religion similar. So I said, and this was a large-scale research that they were looking at India, they were looking at Turkey, they were looking at lots of different kinds of places, Ghana and so forth. And they expected me to then study Brazil because I had 2 books on Brazil. And I said I'd like to do it, but actually not Brazil. I'd like to do St. Martin. Now, St. Martin was not a place they had thought of. They knew it was part of the Dutch kingdom, but they hadn't thought about the island. So when I said, St. Martin's the place with an enormous amount of ethnic groups and an enormous amount of religious groups.
That's right.
So I said, if you want to actually understand this, then I can do the research there. And I said, I lived there between my 16th to 18th birthday, so I know the place. I was part of the new ethnicities coming in. So they had to think about it, and then they said, okay, we never thought about it, but we want you, so we'll do St. Martin. So that's how I then began to do anthropological work here on St. Martin, asking myself, how does this function with all its ethnicities and all its religious groups? And I realized that on St. Martin, interestingly enough, what glued the society together next to the economics was Christianity, but then Christianity understood as a meta-language. And what that meant was that people did not have to be Christian to actually adhere to Christian ethics. It was a particular kind of ethics that held people here together. One of the ethics was a recognition that everyone has fault. No one is completely perfect. One of the recognitions was that one should be neighborly, one should be welcoming, and so forth. And these Christian ethics, which became a language that people spoke, was actually the glue that kept people together. And interestingly enough, it was the radio disc jockeys like Fernando Clark and DJ Shadow and so forth, who were actually playing soca and reggae and hip-hop. They were pushing this Christian meta-language on the airwaves. So it was the media, and therefore media is a vital consequence. The media was telling the people of St. Martin, we're okay. We have issues, but we're okay. They were not saying one particular group is a problem here, which you found in many other parts of the globe. In Rwanda, radio was vital in that genocide.
Correct.
In the media played a pivotal and a dangerous role during the Second World War with fascism. But here on St. Martin, the media, the radio, was pushing a recognition of the diversity, but also a need for unity. So I wrote then a book which was published by the University of California Press called Chanting Down the New Jerusalem. And I got the term from a DJ called Mama's Pearl, who would often say that. We're going to chant down the New Jerusalem. And the New Jerusalem was St. Martin. And St. Martin was a place where many faiths met, many people met, and they found a way of creating something like a decent society, or they were trying to create a decent society.
I'm curious, even with that title, if you break that down a little more in terms of what you mean by chanting down.
Chanting down. A chant is something of a kind of
rhythm.
It's a musical. It's a kind of poetic speech, musical poetic speech. And remember that poetry is language trying to be music. So it was about bringing down this Jerusalem, bringing it to earth, trying to create it in the everyday little things that people did. Interestingly enough, they recognized also that there was a counterforce, which was making it more difficult for that to happen.
Gotcha.
on this island, or a set of counterforces.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So one of the things I'm curious about is even your approach when it comes to doing studies, especially as an anthropologist. What do you look for at first to lay out your research topic?
First, I try to understand how people speak.
Okay.
So anthropology is not a science of immediately asking questions. It's not about interviews. It's about what they call deep hanging out. So which means you need to be somewhere, live amongst people, don't ask too much questions, participate in life like they participate in life. And then you start to understand what words they consider important, what's behind these words. You have to find out who is kin with whom. So who trades with whom? Who falls in love with whom? Who fights with whom? And when you know these types of things, then you start to begin to ask questions, but the questions are conversations that you're having with people. And then you start to understand, okay, so this might be what is happening here. When I did the research, I was not thinking first of looking at the radio disc jockeys. But being there, I recognized the radio was on all the time.
Yes, radios,
in the cars, and the buses, and so forth. So then you realize, oh, this is something that's happening. And then you realize people say, I'm blessed. And so they're using language, and then you start to recognize when you put all these things together, there's a pattern. And the pattern is a particular kind of ethics. But it's such an open Christian ethics that it's open enough to accept Hinduism, Buddhism, and so forth, because it's a meta-language. It is similar to what the Caribbean is, a Creole space, a place where things mix. It doesn't mean it becomes one big hodgepodge, but whatever you find in the Caribbean, you find the other traces
There's
in
an amalgamation.
it. Yeah. So that's how I came to it. And I believe in tacit knowledge, so people can never tell you as much as they know. Therefore, you have to do it with them.
I like that. So what also comes to mind for me is, after completing your research and considering the conclusion of the meta-Christianity that you just spoke of, what were perhaps let's say the main markers that still stand out to you today in your view of St. Martin? What
remains prevalent? Well, one of the things that was argued in that study, and which remains, was what I call the money tie system. And the money tie system meant that people on St. Martin were connected through money and power ties with one another. And that went across ethnicities and across classes. So which means you would not understand St. Martin if you did not understand that the housekeeper can have a relationship with a political leader. The class division is there, but through the money tie system, they are connected to one another. They can speak one another's language. St. Martin politicians have a knack of being able to speak like the ordinary folk speak. There's a connection there. And recognizing that connection, it's still there. There are, given when you have an economic downfall, then you see that tensions arise. People start speaking in ethnic terms. However, because there has been because no one of this generation, your generation, no one grew up with a St. Martin that was monocultural.
That is true.
So which means what people know is that on St. Martin you will hear what is called St. Martin English or St. Martin. You will hear people who speak like me. You will hear people who speak like people from St. Kitts. You will hear lots of Spanish. You will hear Creole. You will hear the Martinican and the Guadeloupean versions as well. That's what you'll hear. So you have a proliferation of languages, even though everyone has a lingua franca, which is the St. Martin, but you have all these others around. And you know that when you look at what St. Martiners eat, they eat everything. And everything is here.
That is true.
From Chinese to Hindu food, to Indian food, Thai, to all kinds of Creole, everything is here.
Variations of European foods, yep.
So people are constantly ingesting each other and ingesting each other's cultures. Therefore, you can't think of St. Martin as loose ethnicities. That's a first look at it. A second look of it is to recognize that these things are constantly intertwining. Class matters, but it's a complicated class thing here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But one thing I'm curious about is, we, for example, often speak about us not necessarily learning much of St. Martin history, in school or to a deeper level. And then, I think, so considering that and considering all the mixture that took place, it's like what has been lost, or a lot of elements of it. But it's also trying to live, to remain, because then, of course, you have a lot of those who lived through that period of what was, wanting to pass it down. But then it's being met with a new pair of eyes, new set of ideas, a different mindset and whatnot. So I guess my question to you is, how do we move forward, with the understanding that, you can't necessarily copy-paste history and what took place in the past, but also, I guess, not moving past too much away from, I guess, the foundation or the core of what built St. Martin, what St. Martin is. If you get what I'm saying.
I do get what you're saying. I think we have to be precise here. If what is meant is that one cultural element of the melange that is St. Martin, that needs to have more attention, then no one can be against that. So if you say the cultural element of the old comers that are called locals, that cultural element needs to get more attention of how that was and certain practices and habits and traditions and the history of that element of St. Martin? Yes, for sure. If you say that element has gone lost, then I say no, the element has integrated with the other elements that are here now.
Currently, yeah.
If you say, so I would say you need to teach that element, but you need to also start teaching from what St. Martiners are. And St. Martiners are what you would call a situation of Creole cosmopolitanism. That means, and a Creole cosmopolitanism is not worldly in that sense. It is, you recognize that you have a local situation which you must know well enough, and all the elements must get their space. But everyone here, many people here have links all over the region. So which means you have to teach the region.
Yep.
And since part of the mix are people whose grandparents were not from the region, and since St. Martin is taken up in a global economy and global geopolitics, you have to teach people about global developments as well. So which means, to me, the struggle in Haiti, which was an event of global significance, is something that all St. Martin students should learn. Partly because one of the cultural elements on this island, one of the strong cultural elements, is a Haitian cultural element, which is part of everything taken up, and because it was in Haiti where you got for the first time the idea that all humans, regardless of their hue or their ethnicity, and then they struggled for gender, should be considered human and should have
free,
equal dignity.
Correct.
That is something that everyone has to learn. So you learn about the cultural elements of the old comers, you learn about that cultural element, you might even learn about the elements that happened in St. Kitts. You might learn about the elements, some elements that are of consequence in the non-alignment movement, of which India played an important role, Nehru. You might learn part of that as well, so that St. Martiners become what they are, Creole cosmopolitans, global citizens that are grounded on St. Martin, love the island, love the interaction, but can speak to global developments and can use their internal diversity as a strength to be able to move forward.
Gotcha. Yeah, I appreciate that response. And then I guess finally on that topic, then from an anthropology lens, how do you review the economy and its social impact? What do you mainly look for?
What do I mainly look for? Well, St. Martin, of course, I used to call this a Visa card gold type of society. So I used to make the distinction that you had white gold, black gold, and Visa card gold societies in the Caribbean, to avoid speaking about British, French, Dutch, and so forth, Spanish. White gold societies were agricultural societies. Banana, sugar, salt, that connected people. So parts of Haiti were connected to parts of St. Vincent because they were white gold societies. Black gold societies is why Aruba in the time of the Lago and Curacao in the time of Shell resembled Trinidad more than it resembled St. Martin.
Yeah.
Because these were industrial-based societies. They function differently. Industrial-based societies are societies where you have newcomers, but the newcomers live separately. They keep much of their cultural traditions separately. So in Aruba, you will have San Nicolas. In Curacao, you had a space where the Dutch lived and so forth. Visa card gold societies, hospitality-based societies, are societies with an enormous diversity and lots of intermarriage, lots of commingling. So you have many different mixtures happening.
Yeah.
And they don't live really necessarily separate. That's not a necessity in these types of societies. St. Martin is a Visa card gold society. So given that, then you would need to always think policy from that perspective, but also think the economy from that perspective. If you are tourist-based and you recognize the two most important things that are happening now is care tourism, parts of the people in the North Atlantic, they're graying, and these were people who started to come to St. Martin when they were in their 30s. Now they're going to their 60s. What are you doing to accommodate that set of economic demographic that you might need? There is also the niche markets, the African-American market, for instance. That's a niche market.
Yep.
How do you accommodate that younger demographic? Because they're younger coming in. They want something else. So you need to think about that. There is a digital revolution happening across the globe.
Yes.
St. Martin needs programmers, so which means you need to have an educational system in which from a young age, St. Martiners will not only be consumers of all the digital apparatus, but also producers, programmers. So which means you probably need to think in your education department and your economic department. I know Miguel de Weaver of the economic department is thinking about this. How do you make sure that St. Martin presents itself in that world, because that is growing and the jobs will be there. So it's not only about attracting businesses to St. Martin, but it's also about attracting programmers, businesses that will say, let 500 of my programmers live on this island because the island is hospitality driven. It has a good nightlife, which many young people who are programmers would like to have for a certain time. And let me think about schooling and educating my population so that later on they can also be recipients of these kinds of jobs and also persons who can produce these types of companies.
Definitely.
And consultancies and so forth.
Definitely. So with that, we're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back.
You're welcome.
Welcome back, everyone. You're tuned into the news behind the news with Ralph Cantav on Mix 94.7 FM. And this afternoon, I'm joined with Dr. Francio Guadeloupe. So in addition to, you're being a professor and a researcher, you're also the chair of the Island or Islander of the Helm project, which delves into climate change. So can you give us some background info on this, and when did you guys begin as well?
That's a good question. Yes, Islanders at the Helm is a research project that is funded by the Dutch Research Council for 3.5 million euros. It's a 5-year project, and the project is to study how people on the 6 Caribbean islands, Aruba, Curacao, St. Martin, and St. Eustatius, how they are adapting to the climate challenges that are ensuing right now. The name of the project is interesting because it was inspired by inspired, thought up by Maria Plants, who was a St. Martiner. And islanders at the helm necessarily is a navigational metaphor. It reminds us that all the people on St. Martin arrived here on ships. Ships are vital because the people from Africa came with ships. The people who we call Amerindians also came with ships. And later on, the other peoples that arrived, they came with ships. If you can think the island as a ship, then you think it also as a sanctuary, a sacred place. So therefore, we're not trying to make a distinction between the islanders and the island. Both have to go well, and they have to be at the helm, which again is navigational. They have to be in control as they navigate into the future where we're facing these climate challenges. These climate challenges have to do with, for instance, that you will have more hurricanes, and the hurricanes will be they will be stronger in force. You will face more earthquakes. You will face periods of drought, longer periods of drought. It will become hotter. A place like Aruba now, many parents pay monthly for air conditioning because it's therefore impossible to be in a school if you don't have air conditioning because Aruba has gotten hotter. Now, in St. Martin, it is the hurricanes. How do you prepare for the hurricanes? And therefore, the researchers have to study, what do people make? How do they spend their money? Is there a pattern whenever there is the period of the hurricane period, in what people buy, what they eat, what they consume, and so forth? They will have to study, how do people build houses? Or what kind of houses are built? How do they rent it? How do they furniture their houses? What do they consider beautiful aesthetically? Right now, you see many concrete houses rising, which is to protect against hurricanes. But are these houses in which people can live without air conditioning, for instance? A concrete house is very good for hurricanes, but it's bad if St. Martin is scheduled to get more earthquakes.
Yes, correct.
So which means you need to think about that as well. The question of water is vital. How is water being managed here? So lots of these matters will be discussed. And when we look at water, we're not only looking at water as the fluid, but also water as a metaphor. Do people use water during Carnival? And how did they use it? So it's not only the consumption of it, but how is it part of their cultural way of life, cultural way of lives, I should say. And in Islanders of the Helm, there are anthropologists, there are ethnomusicologists, because sound matters. After a hurricane, people need to hear a particular kind of sound so that they can calm down.
Yeah, that is true.
You recognize that when I was here and Irma hit, that something that the radio stations did, and I don't know if they did consciously or unconsciously, is that they continued playing music that you would hear the day before. If you have a massive discontinuity, there has to be continuities. The radio, the soundscape was the continuity that made people think it's going to be all right. It's going to be okay. And a particular kind of music.
Yes.
They played.
Definitely.
But the ethnomusicologists will think, what sound do you emit? Not only what music, but what sound do you emit to calm people down? What sound heals the psyche after these types of things? There is a archaeologist and a ethnobotanist and a paleoecologist that will study what is growing here. There are certain plants that grow here that are good for malaria. They're not supposed to be growing here, but they're growing here because of the globalization of things. All things arrived here. There is a plant I understood from Jacqueline Hoffman, who's a journalist here. There's a plant that grows here, which actually grew originally in the cloisters in the Netherlands. The plant died out in the Netherlands, but the plant is on St. Martin, growing. So the paleoethnobotanist will start to understand what's growing here. How is the soil? These types of things. And look at heritage as well, the archaeologists. Which parts of the heritage should be protected? This is what we were speaking about beforehand. One of the cultural elements, the cultural element of the people who were here, the first comers. That heritage needs to be protected because it's the heritage of all the people here, because it's part of the mix.
Correct.
There will be Lisanne Charles, who lives on St. Martin as well. She's one of the PhDs in political science, political anthropology. She's going to study how is policy being made. Policies and laws and so forth, practices, procedures, when we're in the hurricane season. And then she's going to look at all three islands, so St. Martin, Save and Station,
SSS.
compare them
Gotcha.
in looking at that. And so forth. So we'll have 11 researchers. One will look at human rights and look at human rights legislation. How is that of consequence here on this island? The right to housing is a human right. Is that being respected? And why not? And so forth.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
When is your deadline to complete this research?
Well, we have 5 years, and we started last year, February.
Okay, so
and that meant
that's
I had to
quite
hire
some time.
people. So quite
Well,
some
there's a
time.
lot of information to collect
Correct.
as well.
Yeah, quite some time, yeah. And one of the researchers will be here, I think within a month. That's Shirley Emanuelson, because for the Rijksmuseum, she has an exhibition on climate change and climate challenges. So she'll be taking pictures here, and that will be part of that large exhibition of how St. Martiners are preparing for the situation that's coming, the ecological changes that are coming, the climatical changes, I should say, that are
So
coming.
one thing that comes to mind then, having done at the point where, all this research is completed, what is the hope as far as what will be achieved, what will be used for?
Yeah. Good
How
one.
do you intend to, ensure that we don't go through this cycle of, we do some amazing research, but then it just sits on a desk and not necessarily turns into policy and action. But
Very
also that the
good.
community can be empowered through that information and make actual changes with that, that knowledge.
Very good one. Let me say two things about that. One is that one of the outcomes of the research should be a research center focusing on climate challenges, whereby the researchers, and we've tried to employ many researchers from the islands as PhDs or postdocs, that they will then be able to be part of this research center that will be multidisciplinary, and that they will work for all 6 islands. And therefore, we hope that all 6 islands and The Hague funds this, whereby they would have 40% research time and 60% teaching time. So which means they would also work for the University of St. Martin, teaching, but 40% of their time would be to do fundamental research on these matters. So someone like Lisanne Charles or Shirley Emanuelson or Charissa Granger, who's currently at the University of the West Indies, but an Aruban ethnomusicologist, that this group of persons will then have the opportunity to say, okay, we can now be employed by this research center, and we're working in the benefit of all the islands because there are different challenges. So for Aruba, it will be more coastal erosion and the heat. Here it will be more hurricanes and later on earthquakes and so forth. And they will be working on Bonaire. It will be that they are very low, so they are easily flooded, and part of that island will disappear. But we continue doing what we're doing. So that will be one of the outcomes. A second one is that Corinne Hoffman, who's a professor at Leiden University, one of her tasks will be to organize a transatlantic academic platform, whereby universities in the Caribbean and universities in the Netherlands will work together, exchange staff and so forth. So which means the University of the U.S. Virgin Islands, that's part of this project, the University of St. Martin, the University of the West Indies, University of Puerto Rico, will be working with the University of Delft, the university, because Delft has PhDs and postdocs, I didn't mention that, Delft, University of Amsterdam, Leiden University, and also where I work, the Royal Netherlands Institute for Southeast Asian and Caribbean Studies, the KITLV. In Dutch it's called something else, but so that you can move persons around, that you can say, okay, there's a course that's being taught now at Delft University on extreme architecture. Why wouldn't students who are studying at USVI or USM be able to take that course? There's a possibility of taking part of the course, blended form, so part of it online, and part of it let the students meet one another on St. Martin and take another part of it, the practical part, here.
Gotcha.
And that trans-academic platform, which Corrine Hoffman has to run as the co-PI in this project, that has to then stand after 5 years, whereby academics are speaking to one another, academics and intellectuals on both sides of the Atlantic.
Okay, that's one of the things that stood out to me while I read a background on the project was the social adaptation of climate change, and from your point of view, how do you see us achieving that?
The social adaptation on climate change. There are small things that one can do. For instance, if you recognize that people live in districts here, communities. One of the modes of adaptation is how should I put it? Is there enough social cohesion there so that whenever an event like that happens, you know who to turn to and you have the possibilities of reaching people? That's an adaptation. So you co-create that together. Another is to recognize how people eat and that there is a right for people to be able to eat healthy foods.
Definitely.
And therefore, you need legislation to make that possible. I was surprised going to some supermarkets here that I couldn't find mangoes. I couldn't find star fruit. These things have to be available because every youngster should be able to have their doses of vitamins. And in this region where these fruits are grown, people's palate should also, or their taste,
reflect.
Apples, blueberries, fine, and mangoes and passion fruit together. Because that's St. Martin.
Yeah.
All of these together.
I think sadly, though, even, I guess a little bit on that note is sometimes you would see, fruit trees, let's say you said star fruit made in apple and the like, and they just rot because people don't pick them. And, so like I grew up, with that palette, you could say, when I would see any of those fruit trees, especially if they're in people's yard and you can't reach them, it's like, man, I wish, someone was home that would allow me to go and pick them. But, I think that is a part of going back a little bit into the mix, the melange of our culture, where certain practices kind of change because, we adopt a different taste, we adopt different habits, because I remember a time being at the Emilio Wilson Park, seeing this little boy and his little sister running around and picking pommes-frites. And I was like, wow, children still pick pommes-frites, So it made me think about the times where me and my friends literally would miss our school bus because after school, Max School, along there in St. John's, used to have a lot of pommes-frites trees. And we would literally just be there for, over half an hour just picking pommes-frites and comparing who got the biggest one, the sweetest one, and so forth. So, So
like I said, things don't disappear. They just integrate with the rest. Denisio White is someone that is part of this project, and he has a garden, and he produces lots of stuff. Now, this is a figure that's doing something. That's someone you need to follow and understand and study with to be able to produce those things. And again, it's about showing the best practices, showing also practices that are not so good. And if the islanders are at the helm, it is up to the islanders to decide how they're going to do it. It will not work to impose because you have your good intentions. This is the way you have to do it. Those days are gone.
I have a question because I do know, as you mentioned, the hurricanes, which we know is a serious issue, but also looking at, I guess, man-made climate effects such as the dump, in that regard, because, the fumes that it emits is also very toxic. And we still have a situation where persons live there, So I'm just saying that because I'm curious as to, different areas where you guys will be, connecting with the local community and getting those persons' experiences so that, again, when the research is all completed, something can be done with it into some tangible change.
Well, you've said it. So that's a space where you need to have anthropologists and the persons who are doing extreme architecture and urban planning and environmental management. They would have to be there to understand that, because that is part of the challenges that are faced. How are people coping with this? Why are they coping with it the way they're coping with it? So what are the power dynamics and mechanisms? All this has to be understood and then presented back to the societies.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So with that, we're going to take our final break and we'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone, to the news behind the news on Mix 94.7 FM. And so, Mr. Guadeloupe, one of the things that also stand out about, all the work that you've done is that you are also an author, as you mentioned in the beginning. And you have a new book that's coming out that's called Black Man in the Netherlands, an Afro-Antillean Anthropology. So my question for you regarding this book in particular, I think you wrote about 6 books?
Yeah.
How does this book stand out among your other work? And did you struggle to balance your voice as an anthropologist compared to your personal experience?
Mm-hmm. Good one. This book was written in a style in which there are personal stories of myself, stories based upon research with persons in the Netherlands, primarily of Antillean descent, but not exclusively. And there's a lot of discussion and engagement with the writings of others, for it's an academic book. What I wanted to do was write a book that would actually speak about how have people from the Antilles, I still use the term because just like you have the Spanish Antilles and the French Antilles, you have the Netherlands Antilles. It's not a federation of states anymore, but the Spanish Antilles are not a federation of states either. They're just people, and when you live in the Netherlands, Antillean is an identity. In the Netherlands, I consider myself an Antillean because it's an identity, a marker. How do people who came from these 6 islands, or whose parents, one of the parents came from these 6 islands, how have they transformed the Netherlands? That's what I wanted to write a book about. And I wanted to say, instead of always thinking of ourselves in terms of lack and what is being done to us, let us actually look at what we are doing in societies in a positive way. The Netherlands, as it is now, in 2022, has been radically changed in many of the big cities, like Rotterdam, Amsterdam, The Hague, and so forth, due partly to Antillean influences. The biggest festival in the Netherlands that attracts most people is what is called the Zomercarnaval, which is a carnival that was taken from people from Aruba and St. Martin and Curaçao, meeting people from the Cape Verdean Islands and people from Bolivia and Brazil. They created a carnival. A carnival where you hear soca and you hear steel band and you hear tumba and so forth. That carnival is now the biggest festival in the Netherlands. They created that. When you look at the language that is spoken in the Netherlands, I speak Dutch, but there's a version of Dutch that is the version of the youths. It's a semi-creolized Dutch with all types of influences of Surinamese. Hoorde, which is a Papiamento word, is a word you hear people of all ethnicities using.
Interesting.
They've transformed these. When you look at a place like Rotterdam, 1, I believe, in every 6, don't quote me on it, is of African descent. People don't think of the Netherlands in that way, but when you go to these cities, you recognize that these are multicultural cities where people have become part of the fabric. They're not going anywhere, and parts of what they brought, or their parents brought, is part of the mix. So you can't think anymore integration into something. They are integrating with the thing, just like what's happening here on St. Martin. No one integrates into anything. They integrate with things, and they borrow and they lend and so forth, and that's how newness emerges.
So one of the things that come to mind with that book is an article that I saw of a symposium back in 2020 on post-coloniality and decoloniality. And my question is, basically that here on St. Martin, we've had several conversations on decolonization up to presently with the current budget debate that we're having. And considering, this symposium that took place, I took note of the fact that you use the terms decoloniality, and post-coloniality instead of the more popular terms of decolonization and post-colonialism. Can you explain that and the reasoning behind that?
These are different. All four are different concepts.
Okay.
Post-colonialism with a slash between post and colonialism, that the slash indicates a situation whereby formal colonialism is over. So India is a post-colonial with a slash in between. St. Kitts is a post-colonial with a slash, or St. Vincent. When you don't have the slash in between, then you're thinking about the study of the remains, the traces of coloniality in places that are officially non-colonies anymore, and also in places that used to be the colonizers, but there you find also these old traces there. Decolonization is a political process to actually put an end to colonialism. Decoloniality is about breaking the traces of colonial mindsets in schooling, in everyday speech, in the arts, and so forth. So decoloniality is of consequence for countries that are politically independent, for countries that were the colonizer or still have colonial possessions, and for countries that are still tied to France, Great Britain, or the Netherlands. So decoloniality is a broader perspective. Decoloniality says, for instance, that you have to get rid of racial ideas, because racial ideas you find all over. Decoloniality says you have to get rid of certain concepts that you inherited from the times of colonialism. Such a concept in relation to our project is nature. Nature is a Eurocentric concept, because you have nature and you have culture. This is a European divide. So we're not using that term. We're using expressions of life, whereby an expression of life is a human being, an expression of life is a plant, an expression of life is a dog, an expression of life is the enabling environment in which we're sitting now. And how are these things interacting? So life, that's decoloniality. Whilst decolonization might still keep the term nature and say we need nature protection, but then forget about the people that are living there, because you're making the distinction nature, culture. Not making that distinction anymore. That's what decoloniality is about.
Gotcha. Okay. So with that, so before we end off, could you let the people know where can they be able to purchase your books, by the way?
On Amazon, you can find Black Man in the Netherlands. In April, Equilibrity in the Caribbean is coming out, which is a book with various authors that I edited, and they're looking at how are people living their lives. You can keep calling these islands colonies and they're unfree, but what are the practices of freedom? The everyday practices of freedom and the everyday practices of sovereignty that people are engaged in on islands like Bonaire, St. Martin, Curacao, and so forth. And that book will be out in April, but I think you can pre-order it now. The Black Man in the Netherlands you can order now and you'll get it immediately, and I think it's a fair price of about $20-something, if I'm not mistaken. Soft cover. Yeah.
Okay, great. And any final words you'd like to share?
No, I'm just happy to be on St. Martin.
Yeah, I
leave tomorrow.
Oh.
I've had a wonderful time, and in April when I return, then the other 13 researchers will be here. Lisanne Charles is here all the time, but the others will be here. And then with the University of St. Martin, Antonio Carmona Baez, who's the president right now, will have a public event in which everyone will present their research and people can get feedback, because this is about co-creation, so which means we're not just researching other people. We're studying with. We're not studying people. So the with means that they are part of thinking this through. That is why Maria Plansky said it has to be a term
At the helm.
At the helm.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, I
Yeah.
appreciate it, sir. And, to all our viewers and listeners, I hope that you also enjoyed this conversation. Be sure to tune in again tomorrow. Take care.